There are things technology can't explain, and no matter how hard we try, we can't believe it all boils down to a simple glitch. Imagine waking up one day, picking up your phone, and finding a contact you've never saved. It's there, in your address book, with a name that gives you chills just reading it. Don't answer. Up until that point, you think, I'll just delete it, and that's it. But no matter how many times you delete it, it reappears. Worse, at midnight, the phone rings, and the call drops before you can even answer. At first, you might think it's a coincidence, or that someone is playing a prank. But when messages start arriving with information only you know, secrets, details of your routine, even conversations you've never written down, the game changes. It's at that moment that you realize it's not just about fear. It's about trust, emotional intelligence, and your own ability to withstand the unknown. With each ring, you feel like you're not just receiving a call. You're being called for something. And the question remains, why you? What does this number want? And most importantly, what happens to the person who answers? Today, you'll learn the true story of the people who receive the do not answer contact and discover the lengths someone will go to get rid of something that seems to have no end. Get ready, because after hearing this, you'll never look at your phone the same way again. It was an ordinary night in a small American town. The kind of place where everyone knows the mailman's name and where news still travels faster through word of mouth than through the internet. But that week, something began to disrupt the routine with a touch of unsettling mystery. Completely different people, a local mechanic, a literature teacher, a teenage gamer, began noticing the same strange detail on their phones. Among the usual contacts appeared a name no one remembered adding, "Do not answer." The number, though, it seemed to follow a common pattern, conveyed an almost palpable unease. Some tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a system error, a passing glitch. Others, driven by curiosity, tapped the contact to try to identify the source, but all they received was a blank screen, no photo, no call history, as if it were a digital ghost. And here's the point that began to provoke insecurity. Everyone was absolutely certain they had never saved it. The phenomenon soon spread, and stories began to overlap. A 78-year-old woman, known for her kindness and wisdom, said she found the contact shortly after returning from a trip to the city fair. A food delivery driver, who usually used his cell phone only for work, said it appeared after a nighttime run in a remote neighborhood. There was even a local police officer on the list of victims, someone accustomed to dealing with frightening situations, but who admitted feeling a chill down his spine when he saw that name appear out of nowhere. No matter their age, profession, or background, they all shared the same feeling of loneliness and vulnerability in the face of something they couldn't explain. And almost ironically, this strange coincidence began to create a bond of empathy and collaboration between them, as if they were united against an invisible enemy stalking their lives. Some tried to explain it logically. It could be a phishing scam, a hacker test to gauge vulnerabilities. But these hypotheses quickly fell apart when experts analyzed the devices and found that the number had no traceable origin. It was like being outside conventional networks, hovering in the space between technology and the unknown. More daring theories emerged. Some said the contact was a warning, a kind of password for an event yet to happen. Others believed it was something spiritual, perhaps connected to people carrying deep hurts and in need of forgiveness or reconciliation. The strangest thing was that, despite the fear, there was also a spark of inspiration among those affected. If this had appeared to them, perhaps there was a reason. No one knew for sure, but everyone felt that this was just the beginning and that the number wasn't there by chance. When the first brave person decided to delete the contact, he believed he was taking a simple, logical, almost banal action. All he had to do was open his address book, swipe, tap the trash can icon, and confirm. But to his astonishment, seconds later, the name "Don't Answer" reappeared, as if it had never been removed, no matter how many times he repeated the process. The same thing happened to others. They tried turning the phone off and on again, resetting settings, changing the SIM card, even formatting the device. Nothing worked. With each failed attempt, the feeling of helplessness and fear grew. It was like fighting something with a life of its own, something that responded to human action with coldness and intelligence. This detail aroused not only curiosity, but also a strange mixture of resilience and desperation. The desire to find a solution fueled the fight against what seemed impossible. Some took their phones to technicians and digital security experts. Experienced hackers combed through systems, lines of code, and network history. There were no suspicious traces, no hidden applications, no records to justify the contact's presence. A software engineer, driven by initiative and perspicacity, attempted to trace the source using advanced interception methods, but the result was even more disturbing. The number was not linked to any server or cloud backups. It was as if it were engraved into the hardware itself, deeply embedded, immune to any innovation or removal technique. This discovery caused a stir among those still seeking answers, as it confirmed that this was no simple error, but something that circumvented the known rules of technology. And then came the most disturbing part. After each deletion attempt, the contact seemed to respond with small changes. For some, the name was accompanied by a red icon. For others, a blurred image appeared in place of their profile picture, a shadowy figure difficult to identify, but one that conveyed a deep unease. It was as if the thing behind that number was watching, reacting, adapting. Among the more sensitive, the feeling arose that this wasn't just a digital anomaly, but a game of emotional intelligence in which the goal wasn't just to appear, but to control. And as everyone would soon discover, the true test would come. At midnight, when the phone's ringing would become impossible to ignore, the first ring came as a shock. It was exactly midnight when the word "Don't Answer" lit up the screens of several cell phones at once. The sound was the same as the standard ringtone, but there was something different about it, louder, sharper, as if vibrating straight down the spine. Those brave enough to pick up the phone hesitated for a few seconds, feeling the internal struggle between curiosity and self-preservation. But before they could answer, the call dropped by itself. This scene repeated itself night after night, with absolute punctuality. It didn't matter if it was Monday or Saturday, whether it was raining or snowing. At midnight, everyone knew the call was coming. And with each ring, anxiety increased, confidence diminished, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Some tried creative solutions, turning off their phones before midnight, leaving them on airplane mode, even unplugging them to eliminate any power. But reports said that even so, some dreamed of the ringing and woke with their hearts racing, as if they had actually heard the sound. Psychologists suggested it could be a collective fear, but it was difficult to explain how several people in different places could experience the same thing at the same time. This perfect synchronicity demonstrated an almost military precision, fueling the belief that there was something or someone behind it, coordinating every detail with perseverance and patience. The worst thing for some wasn't the ringing itself, but the silence afterward. Those who decided to stay awake and try to answer were never able to. The call would drop at the exact moment the green button was pressed. This game of provocation undermined emotional resilience and planted the idea that the next step would come when everyone was sufficiently fragile. And as if following a calculated script, that next step arrived. It came in the form of messages, and not just any messages. They were sharp, pointed words that aimed directly at the heart and mind of each victim. The revelation came almost accidentally, in a conversation between two victims who decided to meet in person. As they exchanged details of their daily lives. Before being contacted, they realized they had both passed through the same little used road, which connected the city to a nearly abandoned industrial district. Intrigued, they began comparing their stories with those of other victims and discovered something startling. All of them, without exception, had passed that route in the days before the Do Not Answer appeared. Some by car, others on foot or by bicycle, but all had crossed at the same point. What initially seemed like a coincidence began to sound like a patterned dot. At the center of this route was an abandoned gas station, with broken windows and graffiti covered in layers of dust and rust. Local residents, with humility and some trepidation, spoke of old stories, an unexplained fire, an unsolved disappearance, screams heard in the early hours of the morning. Many avoided passing through, and the few who ventured reported feeling the air grow colder, as if they were passing through an invisible barrier. It was at this spot, according to reports, that some heard footsteps on gravel, even when no one was around. The connection between the contact and the outpost was unclear, but it already seemed impossible to ignore the connection. This discovery brought a mixture of hope and fear. Hope, because there was finally a concrete point to investigate. Fear, because it meant everyone had been physically close to something, or someone that could be behind it all. Among the boldest, plans arose to explore the outpost and search for clues. But before any expedition could be organized, one of those marked by the number decided to take another step, answer the midnight call. He believed this was the only way to get direct answers, and with that, began the darkest period in history. It was a clear night, but the silence weighed like lead. At midnight, as predicted, the name Don't Answer appeared, illuminating the room. The man, determined, answered. No voice responded. For a few seconds, all he heard was slow, deep, almost animalistic breathing, so close it seemed to be inside his head. Each interval between exhalations brought a suffocating anticipation, as if something were preparing to speak, but never did. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, rhythmic, echoing as if they were walking down a long, narrow corridor. The most disturbing detail was the firmness of those steps. They weren't hesitant, they weren't rushing. They came with a cold, calculated assurance, as if someone knew exactly where they were going and wasn't in a hurry to get there. The sound of shoes rubbing against the floor was reminiscent of old wood or stone floors, and every now and then, a slight shuffle indicated something heavy being carried. The man remained motionless, torn between the courage to listen and the desire to end it all. But curiosity won out, and he remained silent, trying to pick up any clues. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was absolute silence for 2 seconds, long enough to chill one's spine. Then, a louder, closer breath filled the audio, as if the source were standing right next to him. It was at that moment that the call dropped, leaving him paralyzed, phone still in hand. The next day, when he checked the call history, he realized that the call was not registered. And between fear and the confidence that there was now a real lead, he decided to investigate the numbers passed, never imagining what he would find. The investigation began with access to the operator's old records, something that required initiative and the help of influential people. By combing through digital and physical files, they found a piece of information that changed the course of history. The number had belonged to a landline owned by a woman named Eleanor Price. She lived alone in a secluded house on the outskirts of town, and her death had been recorded as unclear circumstances after a fire. Officially, the line should have been deactivated immediately. However, the number was never reassigned to another customer. Witnesses recalled that Eleanor was known for her kindness, generosity, and her habit of talking on the phone for long hours at night. But months before the fire, she began to isolate herself. She reported hearing footsteps on the porch when she was alone and receiving calls when no one was on the line. A neighbor stated that, shortly before her death, she commented on something that followed the calls and was getting closer and closer. The strangest thing, the landline was found intact after the fire, and in the address book, there was a contact called "Do Not Answer," something impossible to configure with the technology of the time. Among the police notes was an enigmatic entry: "Last call received at 12 a.m." This coincidence directly connected Eleanor's fate to the victim's current torment. More than a number, it seemed to be an invisible link, loaded with memory, pain, and perhaps a search for reconciliation or forgiveness. The case ceased to be merely a technological enigma and took on the dimension of a threat that crossed barriers between past and present. And the most disturbing evidence was yet to come, in a recording that would repeat the victim's own voices. The first recording came almost by chance. One of the people dialed the number decided, one early morning, to activate an app that automatically recorded all incoming calls. The idea was simple: to have some concrete evidence to show the authorities. At midnight, as always, the phone rang. He answered and heard only that dense silence, interrupted by controlled breathing, as if someone were measuring every second of what he did. What came next made his blood run cold. A distorted, deep, static-laden voice began repeating phrases. But they weren't random phrases. They were the exact same words he had spoken hours earlier in a private conversation with his sister. It was as if what was on the other end was a sound mirror, reproducing his own voice with small pauses and different, almost mocking intonations. The most disturbing detail wasn't just hearing his own voice, but realizing that the phrases were out of order, as if someone had purposefully cut up the conversation and rearranged each piece. Some parts sounded with a different emotion than the original, changing the meaning. A common phrase, spoken cheerfully, now sounded like a threat. This directly affected the victim's emotional intelligence, shaking their confidence in their own memories. Those who heard similar recordings reported feelings of fear, insecurity, and profound loneliness, as if they were losing control of who they truly were. Among the more superstitious, the theory grew that the number not only spied, but also stole fragments of people's essence. The recording was discreetly distributed among the victims and analyzed by audio technicians. They confirmed that the frequency and texture of the voice were identical to that of the original victim, which would be impossible without access to high-quality prior recordings. This ruled out common hypotheses and reinforced the idea that something or someone had real-time access to private conversations, perhaps even their most intimate thoughts. What had previously seemed like a game of provocation began to take on the appearance of a trap. And as if to prove it still had control, the number made its boldest move yet, a call that, when answered the following night, would lead to the disappearance of one of the victims. On the night everything changed, the group of victims agreed to stay in touch to monitor the calls. The idea was that no one would be alone at midnight. However, Mark, a 42-year-old man known for his courage and stubbornness, decided he was ready to end it once and for all. He stayed in his room, his phone on the table, a recorder running, and a camera pointed at him. When the clock struck exactly midnight, the word "Do Not Answer" appeared on the screen. Instead of hesitating, he answered immediately. On the other end came the familiar heavy silence, followed by deep breathing. But this time there was something else. The sound of a key turning in a lock, slow, metallic, as if it were the door to his own house. Mark stood up, looking around, and felt the air grow colder. From the phone, he heard footsteps, not the ones from the distant hallway as before, but footsteps inside an echoing room, as if they were in the next room. He tried to speak, demanding identification, but the only response was his own voice, repeating the question, distorted and muffled, followed by a whisper, "It's behind you." The recorder captured the sound, but the camera mysteriously froze at that exact moment. Between insecurity and an attempt to maintain confidence, Mark took 2 steps back. The phone fell to the floor, still connected, emitting a low, continuous noise, then absolute silence. The next morning, Mark didn't show up for work. Friends tried calling, but his cell phone was out of range. The police were called and found the house locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. In the bedroom, the phone was on the table, its screen blank and with no history of the last call. The recorder, however, was still working, and the last track contained the sound of footsteps approaching before they stopped completely. There was nothing else. No clothes, no documents, no physical trace of Mark. He had simply disappeared. For the others, the message was clear. Answering the entire call without it falling on its own came at a price. And the last shred of hope now depended on a nearly suicidal clue that perhaps there was a way to end the cycle, but only at a specific location where the last call should be answered. After Mark's disappearance, the group knew they no longer had time to hesitate. Between hurried conversations and fearful looks, they gathered all the clues they had gathered so far. It was then that Lisa, one of the first victims, remembered a detail no one had taken seriously, a message received weeks earlier, in which the number "Do Not Answer" had sent only geographic coordinates and the phrase "Come alone." Cross-referencing the information, they realized that the coordinates pointed exactly to the old abandoned gas station, the same common spot they had all passed before being tagged. The deduction was risky, but it made sense. Perhaps answering the last call at that location was the only solution to break the cycle. However, if it said, "Come alone," it meant whoever went could not count on help. The debate was intense. Going there meant exposing oneself to something that had already shown the strength to cross physical and digital barriers. But there was also a sense of resilience and perseverance in the air, a collective refusal to let fear dictate the outcome of the story. In the end, they chose Ryan, a young man who had lost his sister to the same mysterious disappearance years before, and who now saw the situation as an opportunity for healing and perhaps even forgiveness. He prepared himself with a flashlight, a recorder, and a spare phone, determined to face whatever was on the other end of the line. With each step he took toward the station, he felt the air grow cold and the silence around him weigh on his shoulders, as if the world itself were holding its breath. At midnight, standing in the center of the dust and rust-covered gas station, the phone vibrated. The name "Do Not Answer" flashed on the screen. Ryan took a deep breath, remembering the stories, the sounds, the distorted voices. He answered. First, silence, then the heavy breathing. Then, his sister's voice, exactly as he remembered it, saying, "It's okay, come with me." The words touched his humanity and almost made him take a step forward. But deep down, something in his emotional intelligence screamed that it wasn't her. The recording cut off abruptly, and a deafening sound filled the air. Outside, those waiting saw all the lights in the gas station go out simultaneously. When they entered, Ryan had disappeared. In the center of the floor, only the phone, now with a clear screen, without the "Do Not Answer" contact, and, for the first time, absolute silence. Now that you know this story, stop for a moment and ask yourself, how many times have you ignored signs because you thought they weren't important? How many times have you failed to act out of fear, insecurity, or simply because you believed you had no choice? The truth is, in real life, numbers that won't go away appear in many forms. Problems you avoid, people you don't confront, decisions you postpone. And the longer you delay, the stronger they become. Your challenge may not ring at midnight today, but it's there, waiting for your answer. Will you continue to let it dictate the rules, or will you take control? Remember, courage, perseverance, and emotional intelligence are powerful weapons when used wisely. What you've learned here isn't just a scare story, it's a warning about how to face what haunts you, even when it seems impossible. So tell me, what number do you need to erase from your life today? Write in the comments, because your answer might inspire someone else to take action. And if you want to continue exploring stories that combine inspiration, emotion, and life lessons, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me next time. Here, each video is a step toward transforming fear into strength and uncertainty into solutions.